Okay, now I hinted at this earlier on when I talked about the idea of validity being kind of a test of how close your results were to a real world. Well, one of the problems is that in the qualitative approach to research, some of these kinds of things don't really work. Like I said already, we tend not to sample the same kind of way, so generalizability is often an issue here. And several researchers have been writing about this, about ways in which we can perhaps talk about the quality of research, but in slightly different kinds of ways when we're talking about qualitative research. By qualitative research, I mean here generally things like ethnography, that is observation in a situation you're studying, depth interviews, observation or collection of data about images and videos and things of this kind. Anything that involves some kind of interpretation of things, rather than counting and measuring, which is a quantitative approach. And I'm going to refer here to Marshall and Rossman. They're not the only ones talking about this. This, by the way, I think that's the first edition. There's been republished a couple of times since then, the book, so you might find a second edition of this. Designing qualitative research. So it's focusing on the qualitative side of the spectrum. And they try and come up with equivalents. I say they're not the only ones. Various other people, Goober and Lincoln, have done similar things as well for qualitative research. And this is the kind of thing they come up with, trying to get some equivalence of what's going on in qualitative research. So I've talked about internal, these are a slightly different order from the order I've gone through them. I started with reliability, but internal validity, the idea that you're measuring something that is really there. It's valid because it's really happening. Well, as I said earlier on, in some areas of qualitative research, if not many areas of qualitative research, the question about the reality of things is raised. Those researchers would argue that the social world we inhabit is not one that's a given, it's one that we as people ourselves create. And so the reality we're looking at is in a sense one that we've created, and we create different ones. And different people may create different ones, and different societies create different social realities. There's no external world with which we can compare things. We've just simply got the social world. So in that case, what we have to come up with is something else, and credibility or truth value is the kind of equivalent that Marshall and Rossman suggests here. I have to say, myself, I'm still dubious about this, because the word truth value itself, to me, suggests some kind of comparison with reality. But there are other ways of doing that. I mean, if you're a philosopher, you know that that notion of truth being it exists in reality is only one way of understanding what true means. And so you can use the term truth value here, but you can't use it in that sense of it's like the real thing, because in this view there is no real thing. And we can also introduce the word credibility, although that mixes things a bit, because I've just talked about credibility in a quite different sense to do with the background of the researchers and so on. But the credibility here is that in some sense the results we're getting are credible, not because they're not funded by drug companies or whatever, and because the researchers are well qualified, but it's credible because we as humans can understand that it makes sense. I think that's the way in which to understand this, that the results are valid because if we were in that situation as humans, with that background, with that experience, then we would be experiencing or be doing something similar. So in that sense, it feels as if it can be true. It's a kind of a credible kind of understanding of things. So that's the equivalent. In the case of external validity, which is generalizability, of course, that's the other term for generalizability. External validity, there's this notion of applicability or transferability. Again, you've got to be very careful about this. You can't just simply generalize from a lot of qualitative research to a general population, because those samples have been chosen in particular kinds of ways that might be biased. So how do you deal with that? Well, you look very carefully at how they were chosen. You think about it. Are there ways in which we could imagine this is biased? And if we can come up with something, then we can adjust for that in some way. We can say that, okay, maybe we've done a sample of, let's say we're looking at work in the workplace. We're looking at several different offices where people are working. and we know we've taken a big office and a small office, and we've taken one that's a young company and a well-established company and so on. So we've got a range of different offices. That gives us some feeling that we can generalise the result we've got, because we've got a range of different kinds of offices here. But it might be that you know, actually there are some quite different offices around that in some way the ones we've looked at are not typical of all offices. Perhaps we've forgotten one thing. Every office we've looked at has got only women working in it. And of course we know that the typical office has a mixture of men and women working in it. So we've got a bias, and we've got to be aware. That's an obvious one, I know, but it's that kind of thing that could happen. So you've got to think through all different ways in which your sample might be atypical and adjust for it if it is. So that's the equivalent here of the general approach, the generalizability approach. In the case of reliability is the notion that you get the same answer next time round. Well, of course, I started off by saying that in much qualitative research, that's a real problem, because in a typical interview, you're not going to get the same answers to your questions the next time round. In fact, you may not even ask the same questions. A typical depth interview will just have a series of topics, and you may ask them in a variety of different ways as you go from one interview to the next. So that kind of strict reliability is quite hard to achieve in qualitative research of that sort. So we have to use other kind of terms here. So we talk about consistency, replicability, dependability. If we replicate the study, are we going to get similar kinds of results within the bounds of what we expect? You know, given that we're asking about the same kind of topics, we get roughly the same kinds of answers in general. Are we consistent in how we do things? So one way we can be consistent, for example, in in-depth interviews, is by using the same interview schedule. That is the list of topics we're going to talk about. So at least we know that's the same. We may ask the questions in different ways, but we're asking about the same things, so we're consistent throughout it. So again, we can go to some extent, although I have to say reliability is a big issue. And in fact, even talking about it in this kind of way is an issue for qualitative research. Objectivity, can we be objective? Well, Marshall and Rossman suggest we can use these terms: neutrality, not biased, and confirmability. Again, this is the attitude of the researcher. And again, for much qualitative research, this is a real problem. It's so easy to be biased, to be in favour of something. I mean, very often in qualitative research, we're doing research in areas we're interested in. That's why we chose to research it. And our interest often means that we have strong views about what's going on there. And it's very easy in the situations of qualitative research, for example, the face-to-face interview, to let your own feelings show, to let your biases show in some way. It'll be picked up by the respondents, or it might be the ways you interpret things lead in a certain direction and so on. So how do we deal with that? We deal with it by being as neutral as we can, by avoiding bias as much as we can, by being aware of that issue and trying to counter it as we go through. And that way we try and remain as objective as we can. So those criteria had that I started with, the reliability, the validity, the generalizability, and the credibility. Those criteria have their origins in quantitative research, in the experiments, in surveys and so on. But they have been extended to a wider range of qualitative research approaches, such as ethnography, interviews and so on, but with some adjustments.